It's a pleasure to be here. I was saying I can't remember. I think I've been here. I definitely have been here maybe in 2013. I think like since then too. So it's great to be back. It's always a pleasure to be invited to come to Columbia. So when I presented here, I think we were either in the midst of our cash transfer trial or I think we were in the middle of it and just starting. And since that time, we have been lucky enough to get an R01, which was focused predominantly just on data analysis, which is like the most amazing, if you ever see an RFA that allows you to do that. It's enabled us to have postdocs at UCSF and Berkeley and UNC and at the London School. So we've had a lot of folks who've been able to use the data and generate a lot of information, which has been lovely. And we're actually just wrapping up another round of data collection on this cohort right now, which I'll talk about where a lot of this information comes from. These women are now in their 20s and about 60% have kids. So we're actually starting to do some data collection in the children of the women that we followed in this cash transfer study to look at mainly sort of cognitive development in the children and trying to think about how depression and other factors through adolescence may impact the offspring of these kids. So without further ado, I think you guys all know this, but one of the reasons we are focusing on young women is because about 3/4 of all new infections in the 15 to 24-year-old age group occurs in women. And sadly, this picture has not changed. This was 2010. I think UNAIDS had a similar graph from like 2001. I will say what has changed is that there's been a lot more focus now. So I don't know, since 2012 or 2013, UNAIDS, the US government, Pettifor has put a lot more money and resources into trying to reduce new infections in young women, the DREAMS program being one big initiative of Pettifor to put resources into trying to prevent new infections. And at least on paper, I think a strength of those programs is recognizing the importance of structural determinants. This was my dissertation work, which I probably presented this data here, but this is what sort of was the diving board or whatever for all of this work. We did a national survey in about 2002 of 12,000 young people in South Africa. This was like when the DHS was maybe just starting to add HIV biomarkers to their national surveys. So it wasn't super common at that point. Most of the data we were getting on HIV was coming from antenatal clinic surveillance. We didn't have a really good picture of what HIV looked like in men or in the general population of non-pregnant women. And so, we saw this gender disparity, which I think is now really well characterized in the region. But I think also what really sparked a lot of my work was this rapid takeoff of infections in young women. That prevalence went from, about 4 or 5% to, almost 30% in a very short period of time. And really trying to understand what's happening. Why is that happening? Why do we see infections going through the roof so quickly? And so this, has gotten me started thinking a lot. We were interested in adolescence at the time. Actually, that survey was part of an evaluation of a large national prevention campaign in South Africa called Love Life, which the Kaiser Family Foundation and Global Fund were funding. It started in the late 90s. And I always say it's, you're getting old when things start cycling around again. So in the late 90s, adolescents were hot and were like the thing, and there were a lot of programs going on. And then the funding kind of dried up, I would say, in like 2005, and adolescents weren't so in anymore. And I think they're now hopefully, I feel like I start to hear people talking about the importance of adolescence again now with the youth bulge and the fact that, we really need to be targeting young people if we want to get ahead of the epidemic. But some of the things, obviously, that place young people at risk, and actually some of the things of thinking about a life course perspective and trying to think more about life changes, or that, we see young people leaving school, leaving home, entering their first serious relationships. So there's an increase in sexual contact frequency partners. First pregnancies are happening for young women. And those all sort of for young women seem to be happening around when we see that takeoff in HIV, right? At 18, 19 are kind of when some of these things are happening. And then other things about adolescent sex, right? That it can be episodic and not planned. That there's limited access to prevention. They may not have as much, life experience and skills as older people. But it's also a lot of young people have, they haven't had sex yet, so it's also an opportunity to intervene and maybe make an impact on their future sexual health. So some of the things that we've been trying to think about, so we started off definitely thinking about these structural factors. So from that survey, one of the most important factors that we saw seemed to be associated with infection was school. So girls who had not completed high school were 4 times more likely to be HIV positive as those who did complete school. So that's something we've focused a lot on. The cash transfer trial came out of that. I'll talk about that. But obviously poverty, gender inequity and violence, and mental health are other important determinants. And these are things that UNAIDS in like 2013-14 called out. They called out these hidden populations that had been left behind by the epidemic. And one of those populations were young women. And they really called out some of these structural factors as things programs need to think about. I think the other thing that we've tried to think a lot about, and that the current R01 we have, is that, we're really good at thinking about individual level risk factors, but how do we better measure these factors beyond the individual? So partner level characteristics, something that Nadia used this data to really do some nice work about thinking about partners and risk. The family, particularly for young people, we know parents and household members, guardians are really important. But there's actually not a ton of great data about the role of parents in prevention. And then community level factors. And then obviously the life course. I think that, and I'll briefly touch on this on our last slide, we're just starting to get into this because we have enough data points now to start to look at how early life events might impact HIV risk later, but we know that adverse child experiences there's a lot of data from the US, right, about negative childhood experiences and how they impact health outcomes later in life. But that is something that we think is really important, thinking about when things happen in young people's lives. So we're not just thinking about, 13 to 19 or 13 to 24 or whatever the WHO definition of adolescence and young people is, but really being cognizant of how, something that happens to you when you're 13 might be really different to when it happens to you at 18 or 19. So this was the trial that we did. I don't have a ton of slides on this because I'm going to talk more about some of the data that's come out of the cohort, but it was a phase 3 trial. We initially wrote this as an R01, and we just had behavioral endpoints. And luckily at the time, we wrote this in 2008, NIMH was really interested in cash transfers. I'm not totally sure why, but, we talked to our program officer about wanting to add an incidence endpoint, and that's what sort of pointed us towards the HPTN. So we put the R01 into the HPTN, and they were interested, and so we were able to get funding to increase the sample size to be able to look at incidence as an outcome. We also were able to look at genital herpes and a number of social behavioral characteristics in the cohort that are listed here, but there's a number of other things that aren't here. Those are very much, I would say, sort of more sexual behavior outcomes, but we've measured mental health, we've measured things like self-esteem, alcohol, and drug abuse, things of that nature. And so basically we were giving 300 Rand, which was about, at the time, like $30 a month, and a third of that went to the young person, 2/3 went to the parent guardian. And the rationale for that was just that at the time, there really wasn't any precedent for giving money in these types of studies to adolescents. There was a lot of concern that giving money to young people would increase their risk. We had to have a data safety monitoring board in this trial because there was so much concern at the NIH about giving money to adolescents. In the end, it was fine. We did not have a lot of problem. So this is where the study took place. It's in the sort of northeastern corner of South Africa. There's a demographic surveillance site in this area. It's close to the Kruger Park that Kathy Kahn and Steve Tolman have been leading and conducting work there for over 20 years. It's a very high prevalence area. So the last time they did a sort of representative survey in 2012, prevalence was 45% in adults 35 to 39, and it's also just like low resource. So this was a former homeland under apartheid. So there's just not a lot there. The infrastructure's poor, probably relative to the rest of South Africa, maybe not to other parts of the region. And a lot of unemployment, a lot of migration. So high labor migration just because there's not a lot of work there. Almost 50% of men, and now almost we see similar in women of working age, are leaving on a regular basis to go to sort of urban centers to work, but their sort of family home unit remains in this area. So this is a summary of what we found. We did not see that the cash transfer over the 3 years impacted HIV or HSV2 incidence. And I think the biggest thing, right, so our hypothesis of this study was that being in school reduced young women's risk, and there's a lot of evidence, like I think a review from 2013, there's over 30 papers showing that cash transfers keep kids in school. It increases enrollment, it increases attendance, and particularly for young women, like the effects are stronger for women, or young women than young men. So we were pretty sure we might not see an impact on HIV incidence, but we were pretty sure we were going to see an impact on school attendance, and we did not. So 95% of girls in both arms ended up staying in school, and like I would say school attendance in the older ages is more like 70% in South Africa. So it is high, and I think that's one of the reasons in retrospect we didn't see effects. I can talk about some of the other reasons why, but that kind of prevented us looking at this mechanism of the cash changed attendance, which then changed HIV incidence. But surprisingly, one of the biggest effects was on intimate partner violence, and I'll show some of this data, but we saw about a 30% reduction in self-reported physical IPV from young women. And I'll talk about we've been able to look at some of the mechanisms around why that is. But it didn't reduce transactional sex or having an older partner, and that is one of the major mechanisms that have been hypothesized as to how cash transfers will reduce HIV risk for young women, that this idea that young women are dependent on male partners and engage in sort of transactional relationships with men to acquire either material or social status, and that so if we give young women cash, this will reduce their dependence on men and reduce their HIV risk. But we did not see that, at least in the data. However, and I'll show this data, I think our original hypothesis held. So while 95% of girls stayed in school, if you did drop out of school over the trial, you were much, much more likely to acquire HIV over the course of the study. And I think one of the big things, and we hear this over, and I'm sure Judy Auerbach is a big proponent of this too, about one, why RCTs are not great for structural and social interventions, but two, context really matters, and I think that's why, so the Eswatini World Bank trial that just presented at IAS this summer did see a really big impact of a very similar type of intervention on HIV incidence. It's actually the first trial to show that, even though there's other studies that have shown impacts on sexual behavior and HIV prevalence. This is the first one. So again, context really matters. Where you do these interventions and what's going on in the background can impact. And so 80% of the girls in our homes already were getting, the government of South Africa provides social protection for poor households. And so 80% of the girls and households in this area were already getting these grants from the government. And so while our formative research and qualitative research suggested that there were financial barriers to girls attending school, I think really there probably were more social barriers to why they were not staying in school than financial. Also, because this area is so poor, the government of South Africa has these programs where they waive school fees and put feeding schemes into the schools. And so this actual district is an area where there are not school fees for secondary school, and there are feeding schemes in the school. So a lot of kids go to school because it's sort of the one hot meal they're going to get in the day. So there were sort of these other factors that, despite sort of what people were telling us about why they weren't going to school, seemed to override. And I'm probably going too into the weeds here, but anyway, we chose to do an individually randomized trial because we really thought the mechanism here was an individual mechanism, a household mechanism, right? If you're too poor to go to school, it doesn't matter if your friends are going to school. So that's what we thought was going on, and in the end, we actually were able to measure that there were peer effects happening. So your best friend is going to school, and you're in the control group, so you went to school too. So we saw that happening. And when they were planning we presented this right when the World Bank, the trial was about to go into the field. I remember talking to them and saying, do a cluster randomized trial. And they were like, yes, we're going to do a cluster randomized trial. So I think that would have avoided some of the challenges we saw. Okay, so moving on. So that was 2015 when we saw that. So back to our original hypothesis that schooling is protective. And so we did see this. So girls who attended school had low school attendance, so less than that 80% cutoff that we had. which is about missing more than 2 days a month, which is sort of this international standard that's used for sort of a lot of cash transfer trials globally. We saw the hazard for acquiring HIV was almost 3, and the same for HSV2, and the same for dropout. So if you then dropped out, and I think these are on a continuum, right? If you're have low school attendance at some point, you're probably going to drop out of school. So again, we saw an increased risk of acquiring HIV, and this was longitudinal. So this is happening after they drop out of school. So it's not that they acquired HIV and then dropped out. We were able, with the longitudinal sequence, to really show the temporality here. I'm also happy I don't know if you guys usually take questions at the end, but if anything's not clear or if I'm going too fast, please just ask. And so this was so Marie Stoner is a former student and postdoc of mine who did this work for her dissertation and postdoc. So this is looking at mediation effects. And basically, if you look here, so this is basically zero, no effect. This was the total effect. So this is the original sort of effect we saw of school. And so if we basically adjusted for having an older partner or having just more partners, the effect of school went away. So really, in this population, the effect of school was being driven by sexual networks. And so really this idea of safe spaces, that when girls are in school, they're kind of in this confined, safe environment. They're also having sex, if they are having sex, so they're less likely to be having sex, but if they are, they're more likely to be having sex with their peers as opposed to older partners. And Marie has also published showing that the direct effect of having an older partner, and again, this is happening after they leave school. So it's not that they're getting an older partner and then leaving school. Temporality-wise, we can see, they're dropping out of school and then they're mixing with sort of networks where men are older and then thus more likely to have HIV. So I think this is important because I think there were a lot of hypotheses about why school is protective or not. What is the black box of school? I can tell you the schools in this area are terrible. I mean, most people don't pass the national matriculation exam, so to actually get the high school degree, I think it's about a 20% pass rate. So, there's a nice model, a guy called Matthew Jukes, who used to be at Harvard, I'm not sure where he is now, that kind of was a conceptual framework for how school can be protective. And one of them was through increased cognition, learning more about HIV in school, sort of some of these more, I guess I would say, educational kind of effects. And not to say that might not be happening, but it definitely seemed like in this case, a lot of it was driven by who you're having sex with, which maybe is not surprising. So this is looking at the physical violence, the physical IPV. So the main effect, right, we saw this 30% reduction, and this is the WHO's questionnaire that they use in their I guess global IPV screen. So it goes from what I would say is less severe to more severe violence, and this is the control and the treatment group. But basically, what it's just showing is that the effect of the cash on violence was the same. So whether it was less severe or more severe violence, we saw the same level of change, the same change in effect. And again, this seemed to be driven by not engaging in sex and having fewer partners. So we don't have evidence to show that the girls got this cash and then something changed in their existing relationship. Right now they have more negotiating power, or it improved the relationship and reduced physical violence. What it seems to be is that the girls were getting this money and then could make better choices about who they were choosing to have sex with, or choosing not to have sex. So again, it's that sort of effect driven by partner choice. So this sort of goes to the obvious point that men are important. And I think this is getting more play, right? At IAS this summer, there was a whole session on how to reach men, particularly heterosexual men in sub-Saharan Africa. We see far worse treatment outcomes in men, and they're far less likely to be testing for HIV. But I think just to confirm, right, there's been debate back and forth in the literature, or I would say conflicting evidence about whether older men are actually a risk factor for women. We did see that having a partner 5 or more years older increased the risk of infection. And interestingly, a doctoral student right now has been using sort of some causal inference kind of like modeling methods to look at age continuously and age of the women continuously. And what it seems like is that older partners pose a much greater risk for the younger girls, which maybe is not surprising, but I think that might explain some of the disparity in the literature, because some of the studies have looked at populations where the women are a little bit older. And these young women, you know, we have a range from like 13 to 25. So where we see the greatest risk is in the under 18s, kind of, that the risk of an older partner is much, much higher. And I think that's just as you get older, there's like competing risks, right? So now it's not that the incidence is lower, incidence is going up. It's just that there's a lot of different ways to be getting infected now. And, you know, as you age, your partner is aging. So like a 2-year age difference if you're 25 is now as risky, right? Because the male partners are now getting HIV. So it's just that you don't need a big age disparity anymore to be mixing with people with a higher risk of HIV. And we also confirmed in this case that if you were engaging in transactional sex, which is a really hard thing to measure quantitatively, but in this case, if you did, and I'm happy to talk about how we measured it, it was risky, but particularly if that was something that was happening frequently. So if this was an infrequent occurrence, we didn't see a significant association, but if you, and I should have put what frequently was, but I want to say that it was like monthly or more. If you were sort of engaging in those types of behaviors with your partner, then we did see a much greater risk. So I think it's interesting in like the HPTN and other funding mechanisms. I feel like people want to be like, let's focus on women or let's focus on men. And we're like, no, let's focus on both parts of the partnership. This is data Sherry Littman, myself, and Kathy Kahn in the same area just finished a community mobilization trial in the same area to look at a mobilization intervention to increase testing, linkage, and retention and care for men and women. And with we're working with a NGO called Sanke Gender Justice, and so there was a lot of work trying to reach men specifically. And basically, what this data is showing, so the intervention this is 2 years of data with. We touched over like 10,000 men, like with these different types of outreach events. And in those 2 years, we tested, let's see, in the clinic, we tested 308 men over 2 years, went to the clinic and tested. And in 6 months of doing outreach testing, we tested 221 men. So, you know, it was interesting because, we were like, every event ended with like these mobilization community events ended with make a plan to test. Like they would write a little thing of how like they were going to go to the clinic and test. And it just didn't happen. And the men kept saying in these groups and our mobilization community mobilizers that were working in these communities kept saying like, we need to bring testing to the community. And we kept saying, well, that's not like what this intervention is. But at the end of 2 years, when we basically saw that testing among men in the clinics was just flat, we just made a decision, even though it was an RCT, to change things and to take testing into the community. So to go to soccer matches, to go to car washes, wherever men were gathering. And I think, you know, really showed that we have to take the testing to the men in this case. I think there's still a question of then how we get men right to the clinic, and Sherry and others have looked at navigation and other ways to link men to testing. But we have a lot of qualitative work from this project that's come out around why men are not accessing care. And we had mystery clients that went into the clinics. We did a lot of quality assurance. We did a whole quality assessment study in the clinics to kind of look at care. And it was interesting. The men that were there really didn't have issues didn't feel like they were being discriminated against or that it wasn't a male-friendly place. But again, those were the men that were there. So I think it's a question of like for the men that aren't in the clinic, right? What are those issues? So that's just to say, like for work with young women, I think really pushing the importance. I don't think we're going to get to zero or whatever the final 10%, you know, if we're not making a really concerted effort to reach men, and not necessarily, I think there's a place for partner interventions for sure, but particularly in South Africa where a lot of young people aren't partnered and aren't cohabiting and are not married, I think we need to be thinking about men, not just as partners of women. So, which is a lot of sometimes the focus when we're talking about young women that people go to. Some other important things that we learned. So this is not maybe rocket science, but for the HIV community, I think sometimes we pick up things from other disciplines and like appropriate them as our own. And that was the case with cash transfers, but obviously these have been around in the development community for a really, really long time as social protection programs. And, you know, they are almost universally means tested, right? So these are poverty alleviation programs for the most vulnerable, the most poor. In almost everywhere in sub-Saharan Africa, these programs are government run, and yeah, you have to apply and sort of meet a poverty threshold to get these usually monthly cash allowances. But in the HIV community here, I think we were thinking more like, oh, young women are vulnerable. We're going to give all young women these cash transfers, or we're going to. I think that's sort of how DREAMS, and certainly the DREAMS program had some cash transfer programs. They cut back on them, I think, as they started to see more evidence about the challenges of doing these programs. But we did a qualitative evaluation for Gates in Tanzania, where they did do those. They were providing cash transfers every 3 months to young women. And what this data is just showing is basically we did not, so this is sexual relationship power. Let's see if I can point. Ooh, no. Is there a pointer on this? Which one is it? That one?
Yep.
Okay, thanks. So this is sexual relationship power. This is obviously depression, the CESD. This is a scale on hope for the future. And then this is having older partner, transactional sex. But basically, this is like the main effect of the trial. And we didn't see an impact overall of getting the cash on any of these kind of mental health power type of outcomes. But when we interacted that with baseline poverty, so if you were poor, we did see significant impacts of getting the cash, right? So increases in gender power for the poorest young women, decreases in depression, and increases in hope for the future. So again, for me, it kind of just like emphasized that these programs, because they are relatively small amounts of cash, I mean, they can have a big impact in very poor people's lives, because the amount, 300 Rand is basically consumption per capita, like one person. So you're basically providing a monthly kind of living stipend for one, for an individual with this amount of money. But, that is if you're kind of living at like, sort of, I call it like hand to mouth. It's probably not going to allow you to accumulate wealth, but it's going to keep you from going hungry, for example. So, these programs made a difference for the poorest. And I think we need to remember that sometimes in our eagerness to find solutions to the HIV epidemic, we don't forget the lessons learned. This was some qualitative work that I think was nice and important. We had a big qualitative component throughout the study. And again, there were a lot of concerns about giving adolescents cash. I think, again, still groups like UNICEF, although they might be changing, but a lot of these big government programs are reticent to giving cash to adolescents because of concerns about making them the primary breadwinner in the family, putting too much stress on the adolescent, and that, again, it could make them vulnerable. But in this case, 78% of the women said that they made their own decisions about the money. So we did make sure they had to have their own bank account. We helped them set up a bank account to get this money, so it went to them. It didn't go to the parent guardian. Only 1% indicated that a boyfriend had any role in decisions about how the cash was spent. 80% indicated that they actually spent the money on themselves. So again, there was some concern that, parents or other people would just take the money away from them. That didn't seem to be the case. We had a lot of systems. There still could have been harms related to cash, but at least for the surveillance systems and the self-report that we asked every time we saw them, we did not see this. The harms we heard about were like teasing from peers, which were sort of minor, sort of like, oh, you're getting the money and I'm not, or those types of things. But again, none of them were severe enough. Like when we asked if people needed help, we never got any people wanting us to do anything about it. And I think one of the most important things that came out of this qualitative work was how important, this was the first time most girls had money to spend themselves and to sort of have this kind of financial empowerment. And we saw this in the Tanzania program as well, which actually I think in a much better way had a financial empowerment kind of program that went with getting the money. But, you know, I think it made them feel independent. It gave them status in their peer networks, which remember, we're talking about adolescence. So a lot of this was really important for kind of feeling empowered as young people. Like I could buy whatever, get my hair braided. I could buy the lotion. I could get these cute shoes. And that like is buying them self-esteem and making them feel good about themselves. So just a lot of, I would say, important things for becoming young adults, like independent young adults, like this cash empowered young women to have. So I think that is kind of an important takeaway of the counter to like not giving young people cash. Not that you shouldn't be careful and think about the context, but in this case seem to really have self-esteem benefits for young people. Yeah.
Maybe a little bit of a side fact.
Yeah.
You said there was facts in terms of HIV.
Yeah.
Did the young women share the money with their peers who were in control?
Yeah, a little bit. I mean, it's hard to know the quantitative extent of it. Certainly there was some reports of, you know, sharing with siblings, sharing with friends, more in the sense of like, I bought her a soft drink, you know, kind of things. Like those types of things were certainly talked about in the qualitative data. Yeah. But I think in that like buying status in your peer group kind of thing. Yeah. So this is going back to the transactional sex. There's a really nice article, if this is something you're interested in, by, oh my gosh, I'm totally drawing a blank on her name right now. But it's talking about sort of theoretical frameworks for transactional sex. And I think a lot of times, right, this is thought about like poverty. I've heard some people call this survival sex, right? Like girls are engaging in this behavior because they can't put food on the table. And it's far more complex than that. And this, that's going to drive me nuts that I can't think of her name. Anyway, there's sort of three, I guess, domains that they talk about. One being give and take are really common in relationships. I used to say a long time ago, like all relationships are transactional. There's a reason we're in relationships with people. If you're not getting anything out of it, like why would you be in this relationship? So I think the question is like, at what point does that cross over to being risky, or like, you know, you're losing power, or you can't make decisions and you're stuck in this bad relationship because of what you're getting. But one of the realms that, besides sort of just normal give and take in relationships, so in a lot of parts of sub-Saharan Africa, like if a guy is not giving you something, this is like a bad relationship. It's disrespectful. It means that he doesn't care about you. And so it's a norm. That's one piece. It's a piece of love, right? And then another piece is this self-esteem piece, like buying status, right, that I was talking about before for young people. And we saw that a lot. A former doctoral student, Meghna Ranganthan, who's at the London School, did a lot of qualitative work, and they did this like needs and wants exercise with young women. And it was really fascinating because their needs were like designer lingerie, and at the time it wasn't iPhones, it was Blackberries. This was like in 2011. And these were like, I need this. This is not a want, unlike Maslow's hierarchy of needs or whatever. These were things that like were essential to being a young woman and like feeling like you fit in. So interestingly, although this was just cross-sectional here, this just showed again this point that for the girls that were engaging in transactional sex, they were like 5 times more likely to have a low self-esteem. So to me, it just speaks to the point of like, if we're trying to change, like just giving cash is probably not enough. And we need to be thinking about some of these things of building self-esteem, then building self-worth, and thinking about yourself as a person and what's important about you. What do you like about yourself beyond, I don't know, that pair of shoes or that BlackBerry or iPhone or whatever that is like giving you, you know, so much self-worth. So I thought that was sort of intriguing. So that's coming out in AIDS and behavior. All right, so moving to mental health, depression was really high. So at baseline, 18% of these girls on the CESD screen at least had indications of depressive symptoms. And there's nothing, it's interesting, so this paper, there's actually no longitudinal data. Well, there's no longitudinal data showing depression sort of leading to HIV incidence in young women. I was like, that can't be true. Like, we must have some data out there, but we could not find anything. So I think this is like one of the first papers showing that girls who were depressed were depressed prior to acquiring HIV. And with a risk difference of about 4. So incidence was like almost 13%, and those were depressed versus 7.5%, those who weren't depressed. And they also looked at mediation, so kind of what were some of the things that sort of mediated that relationship. And interestingly, parental monitoring and involvement seemed to be one of the things that was really important, and actually in a way such that like depression seemed to be then leading to less parental engagement, which then was leading to HIV infection. So this is something we're starting to look at more, but in terms of like the mediators that seem to be coming out as important in our data, certainly parents seem to be really important. I'll talk about, we're starting to do some modeling with looking at like combinations of effects, and I feel like parental monitoring is always one of these hard things, because like our parents monitoring, like maybe you're engaging in, I don't know, riskier behavior, so your parents start monitoring you more, versus like they're a really caring parent, and so and you have a great relationship. So I've never, like when we've measured this and looked at it, we've not always seen really like a consistent story, but we have this one variable about like how much is there a parent or a caregiver who cares about you, and how much do you consider, so they care about me a lot, they care about me some, they don't care about me. And only a third of the girls said that they had a parent or guardian who cared about them a lot or some, which was kind of shocking to me, because most of the things we ask, I feel like there's a lot of social desirability, like 85, 90% of kids say like, yeah, my parent talks to me, and my parent like checks my homework, and which is always was sort of surprising. But this variable seemed to really be jumping out as like, these kids don't feel like they have a parent that cares for them. And some of this preliminary work we're doing, it seems to be really also predictive of HIV acquisition. So again, just thinking about the role of caregivers in young people's lives. So that was sort of thinking about the mental health piece. Jumping to mobilization, Sherry Lippman, who, the nice part in this study is we have from the mobilization trial these cross-sectional measures in the area where we're working of some sort of social structural factor. So Sherry has this quantitative measure of mobilization that she created, and so it's a community level score for how mobilized a community is, and interestingly saw that for girls living in villages with higher mobilization scores, they had lower HIV incidence. So for every standard deviation in village level mobilization, there was a 12% lower HIV incidence. So what I think we've had this whole debate. We developed this intervention to try and, mobilize communities. And I think we still have an internal question of like, are these inherent characteristics of particular communities that are going to be really hard to shift? So it's things around leadership, around critical consciousness, around key issues in the community. There's things about like networks and organizations in the community, and questions about like how much do people in your community care about, it can be gender power or HIV prevention. There's a couple of different scores, but it's just, I think this is a question of like, it seems to be really important, I think, for us as intervention people. Is this something we can shift or not? Like what can we do about this? But I guess I like it because I, again, think too often in prevention and care for interventions, we're not thinking about this level, and we're not trying to shift it in a way that I think, in talking with communities about, what are these things beyond the clinic or the individual level affecting people's lives. So this is just like a summary. So these are things that we've seen since the trial to be associated with incidents. So depression, IPV. So the cash impacted IPV, and I didn't present this data, but a doctoral student has done like trajectories of IPV over time. And I will say, like, there's two groups basically of young women. One group that just from the get-go in relationships are experiencing really high levels of violence in partnerships, like 50%. And then another group that just has sort of low levels of violence over the time that we're following them. And interestingly, recent experiences of IPV were not associated with acquiring HIV. So if you report, my partner, had any of those outcomes I showed you in the last 12 months, we don't see that predictive of acquiring HIV. However, like a lifetime history of IPV, so ever having experience, and that can, well, I think that, yeah, this is just the IPV, not sexual abuse, but that is associated with incidents. And so again, to me sort of speaks, and we're trying to look at this now, but like underlying trauma type of mechanism. So this has again gotten us thinking more about these negative early childhood experiences, thinking about the US ACEs, and like, are these things of, again, it's sort of some kind of cumulative trauma that young people are experiencing that over time is putting them at greater risk of HIV. So not an immediate, I think some of the mechanisms people have talked about with IPV is something is increasing the actual probability of transmission at the time of the event. And again, to me, this speaks to more of a like mental health type of perhaps mechanism. Transactional sex and low school attendance also, and age disparate relationships. So this is moving to like the last part of like what we said we would do in the current R01, other than the data collection, was trying to like estimate, take all this information about what are important predictors of infection, like what are mediators, but then thinking about, can you model combination interventions and see what would have the greatest effect? So there's this thing called the G formula, which is a causal inference like epi method. But so you're basically taking, instead of, and I'm not a modeler, so if you're in the room and you are, I apologize if I totally butcher this, but my understanding, right, as opposed to often where we think of modeling where I'm going to take estimates from different studies and put them into the model. Here, you're actually using your data set, your empirical data, and then you're creating these simulated cohorts with your actual data set, right? So it's all the data is coming from your data, but you simulate, so there's like 50,000 simulations of the observed distribution of the outcomes that you're interested in. And then what you can do is kind of ask questions like, you can say, for example, the risk of girls who are depressed versus not depressed. And what's nice is like normally in these traditional like regression or whatever models we run, right, it's like everybody has the exposure, no one has the exposure, right? It's 0-1. But what this allows you to do is actually like look at the actual either percentage in your population, or say like if we reduced it by 25%, depression by 25%, in the actual distribution of the exposure we're seeing, what kind of impact would we see on the outcome? So it's just a more realistic, like, what might you see in your context? So in this case, Marie Stoner, who was my student, what she did was actually try to get actual intervention effects from the literature for some of these outcomes. So for example, I think this was the friendship bench in Zimbabwe, which was a 36% reduction in depression. This was a cash transfer trial done in Malawi. So kind of taking different intervention effects. And then you basically model, right? So you can model if no one's exposed versus the actual observed. So this was like what we actually saw in the population. So we saw that only 6.8% of girls had low attendance, 18% were depressed, 17% had ever experienced IPV, 8%. So it's, for example, this is what we actually see. And then if we look at that versus nothing, this is the kind of effect that we can see. So you'll see the biggest potential effect here is having an intervention on depression in this population. And even though we saw, so I think what's interesting is that if you just look at the effect estimates, right, we see like a really strong hazard ratio with not going to school and HIV incidence. But because so few girls in our population are like are in school, if we do this huge intervention, we're not going to see a big impact on incidence, right? So that's kind of like not, I don't know, it's maybe like duh, but I feel like we often don't like follow through. We just say, oh, that has that's really strongly associated with HIV. That's the thing we need to intervene on. And again, this kind of takes into account, well, wait a minute, in your population, like how important is it and what kind of effect might you actually see? This is moving to like, so this is what I was talking about. If you actually then take it and instead of just getting rid of the outcome, the exposure, you reduce it by whatever the intervention. You can take something from the literature. You could say like we're going to see a third reduction, or we're going to see whatever. And this is actually then looking at school attendance, almost like no effect. This was depression. This was transactional sex. So you can kind of this over here. So now we're starting to combine effects here. And I think, again, because depression was so strong in this population, it doesn't really matter if we start combining interventions with it. It's just like it's the dominant effect here. So again, this will vary from population to population, but I think it's really interesting that mental health, which is something we haven't done anything in this population on, and there's no mental health services. Like for our study, we were having to refer when people were indicative of, suicidality or had like really high depression indication, and we had to hire a psychologist who drove 2 hours to our site from Nelsford, which is like the closest sort of urban center. So otherwise they get referred to the social work system. I think there's one social worker for every 30,000 people, and pretty much nothing happened. People came back to us and said nothing's happening, So interesting for ways forward. Okay, so this is just a teaser for the early life events matter. So we did, so it's latent class growth analysis. So basically what we did was sort of look at these life events, so sexual debut, pregnancy, leaving school, and death of a parent. And what this is doing is basically modeling the prevalence of so this is like you have 2 of those negative life events. At this point, you have like 3. Up here, you have I think almost all 5. So it's like 4.5, but I went up to 5. And these are the different classes that people fell into. So this red class is people who, this is sort of their trajectory for these negative life events. And this is age down here. So at age, when we started 13, they already had 2 of these negative life events. And by the end, they had almost all of them versus like the pink group who had just like 1 when we started the study, but by the end had caught up to the other group, you can see. And I think this is just looking at it with HIV incidence, and what you see is like the red group has the highest risk ratio for acquiring HIV over the life course. So even though the pink group caught up to the red group by the end, they still didn't have, a risk ratio as high as the group who had all these negative life events when we sort of started and had a much steeper, well, not a steeper slope, but just had started off at a higher risk and continued to increase the risk. And even more like the blue group here was the referent group, even though they also by the end had a lot of and some of these are obviously like you're going to have sex, you're probably in this population, you're probably going to have a pregnancy. So they're not all like negative bad things. But when they happen to you when you're 13, they have impacts later in life. Okay, so I guess I would just say in summary, right, context is really important. And so knowing where you're working and what's come before and, not assuming, I think even in the US, right, that, I don't know, New York is like Boston or Chicago or whatever, like, even within your neighborhoods that you're working in. School, I think despite not seeing an impact of this cash transfer in this trial, I feel like we have pretty convincing evidence that school is important and has multiple benefits. And that's, the safe space sexual network piece seems to be really important. Mental health matters, right? I think I talked about that. And cash can have impacts on some of these mental health outcomes like violence and depression, especially for the most poor. We need to intervene with young men. And we just talked about early life events matter. So I think the hard part at this point is trying to convince funders that like doing combination types of interventions in a rigorous way are worth funding. I think sometimes, especially with NIH, study section gets scared. Like this is too complicated. You can't tease apart all the different effects, unless you're going to have like I don't know how many arm factorial trial, which you usually can't afford in an R01. So I guess how do we do these in a more convincing way? The DREAMS initiative through Pettifor, I think, was really great in suggesting a lot of different stuff. We'll see the evaluations are sort of starting to come out, but I think from what I've heard on the ground, it was, they had to like implement that at the existing Pettifor network in most countries, which I know just like in the city of Johannesburg meant there were like 12 implementing partners, and like 15 different programs. And from talking to folks at the POP Council here who've done some of the evaluation, like it was just really hard. People didn't know I got a DREAMS intervention. So when you go and try to attribute like the intervention to the outcomes, it's just messy. So I'm not sure, it would have been really nice, and we said this from the beginning, if they had put a little bit more energy and money into trying to do some more rigorous evaluation. But, hopefully we'll be able to see some of these combination types of effects from that program. But there's not a lot out there other than that I know about. So I think we need to work harder there. And none of this would be possible without many, many people, especially my co-PIs, Kathy Kahn at WITS, MRC WITS. She's based in Joburg, but again, they work up in Agincourt, and Xavier Gomez Olive, who's the research manager, and a whole host of folks at UNC, UCSF, Berkeley, and the NIH. So thank you.
Fantastic piece of work. And still going on. Let's see the questions. Okay. I was particularly struck by the community mobilization effects on HIV. And I wonder, what were the mediating factors which of these various factors that you individually characterized were affected by community mobilization, and how did that actually get done?
Yeah. We haven't done it yet, but Sherry and a postdoc are working on that right now. So trying to look at some of these potential mediating factors of mobilization to the outcome. So yeah, that's a good question, and that's something that they're looking at. And also, like, not all the parts of the mobilization scale, so there's different domains, seem to be as salient. And I think, I'm not going to remember right now, but I think there's like 4 domains, and sort of 2 of them seem to be really important, and 2 not so much. So I think that also helps give us sort of clues about maybe what pieces are working. You know, leadership, I think, is one of them that seems to be important, and that's something that's really hard. You know, if it's an elected official or a tribal leader, you know, if it's somebody who's really anti-HIV or doesn't want to talk about the issues in the community, or it's a really divisive community politics, that's something that is sort of really hard to negotiate. So, yeah.
Susan.
I mean, this work is stunning. I'm really impressed with the multidisciplinary aspect. You covered variables from so many different domains in a really empirical way. I want to go to community mobilization just to ask how we find out more about the operationalization of community mobilization.
Yeah, so Sherry's published pretty extensively, Sherry Lippman. So the validation of the score, I'm happy to send the publications around if there's to whoever can send to people. But yeah, the validation paper is out, the trial paper's out, and then there's also a paper kind of talking more about the intervention and the different domains and how they map to the conceptual framework. You know, I think one of the challenges, so a big piece of this was sort of, the end piece was action. So, right, it was like building critical consciousness, a lot working with leadership, sort of identifying community networks. And a lot of this comes from sort of social movements, which comes from some of, you know, US work. And there's just not a lot of parallels for sort of rural communities in low and middle income countries. So that was like a challenge of trying to find what are organizations that people turn to. The church is one, but it's not always sort of an area where like social change has been fostered. So that was a challenge in developing it. But this taking action piece, I think, is hard. And that was something we really had to build into the intervention that like Sankei hadn't done before. And I still think that's the piece that's the weakest in the actual intervention module, is getting individuals and communities to think about how they're going to take action and what that looks like. Sankei as an organization has focused more on like political, so because they come from a gender-based violence background, right, they've started going to the courts, doing a lot of like protesting. And so a lot of times what happens in South Africa with sort of rape cases is that the legal docket goes missing, or, you know, there's sort of just judicial like mishaps. And so they've done a lot of activism around that with the media and in the courts. And I think it was harder in this type of setting to think about like what did that activism look like. And so, you know, we did do some activism training towards the end, which we weren't doing as much. Again, this is like, so one of our challenges, like it's a cluster randomized trial. If we go up to the provincial health department and start making noise, like, you know, do we start like messing with our design? And I think that's something that we had constant, like a little bit of, you know, whatever, disagreement with like Sankei, because they were like, wow, in the ideal world, like, yeah, we would be like holding overarching bodies, you know, accountable for stockouts, or like at one point all the counselors, all the test counselors were on strike for like 3 months, you know? So like things like that affect whole areas that are really important.
Thank you for that presentation. It was great. I was thinking about the slide that you put up, you know, with the different factors leading to increased HIV incidence. You mentioned this a little bit about the family structure. Yeah. So I was just hoping you could talk a little bit more about that, because it seems that, you know, the family kind of environment could have an impact on all of those things: depression, intimate partner violence, older partners, and kind of the cultural aspects of that too. Are these very large families where, you know, these adolescents kind of feel lost, or are they small families, but because of high poverty levels, the parents can't be home as much as they want to, and they're, you know, just trying to provide for their families? So did anything kind of come out in the qualitative data or anything you collected, or quantitative data that links a lot of these things?
Yeah, so we're actually trying to do more work right now on the parent, the household structure. So I have a doctoral student who's been looking more at the traditional like orphaning, and then also looking at like who are men in the family. So if dad's not there, like is there another adult male, and is he a family member or not? And but I think there's more to it than that. And so I think quantitatively we're trying to look at it at least with the how like we have very demographic, right? Like household rosters and who's there at different rounds, and at least self-report mainly with the primary caregiver that they self-identify. But we allow that to not be apparent because yes, I think 60% of them have a mom. Only it's much lower for reporting, living with the father, and that's pretty typical of this area because of labor migration. There's I'll call her a demographer, Sangeeta Madhavan, who has worked in this area for a long time and done a lot. So this area originally was set up with like kinship networks. So a lot of people are related to each other, in some way. And so you do see that households are kind of structured that way. A lot of female-headed households, whether that's grandma or mom or aunts and sisters, not as many men, at least of working age around because they are working. But that is changing now. We are seeing women, I would say in the last 10 years are much more likely to also be migrants for work. And so, yeah, who's left behind? Maybe older siblings, or if there are grandparents or aunts and uncles that are there that are older. But yeah, I think that it's a challenge, but that is something that quantitatively we're going to try to do. Our qual data isn't that great on that because it just wasn't a focus really at the time of what we were collecting. But I agree, thinking, and we have a pilot intervention that we're trying to get funded right now that has kind of a parent caregiver piece to it. But I think thinking more about those types of things and how to involve parents, which is challenging, is important. Yeah.
Thank you so much for that presentation. I feel like I learned so much. I'm curious, I'm struck by the depression finding, and I'm curious about how you're thinking through that now, because it strikes me that as you conceptualize that depression is also a symptom of so many different structural factors, right? Which is responsive sometimes to some individual level interventions like counseling, but also we don't address the other multi-level factors that are leading to that kind of stuff. So I'm curious how you've been thinking through, after that finding, potential interventions, maybe new ways of thinking through addressing depression.
Yeah. So as an epidemiologist, definitely I'm not somebody who studied mental health. I sort of feel ill-equipped. I actually taught for a while, but in the last year, talked with Kathy Sikkema before, and she was like, I'm moving, I can't think about this. But, she has a trauma-informed intervention that they did in South Africa, adapted in South Africa for women living with HIV. But I'm really intrigued to think, so I do think that one mechanism, obviously there's the structural stuff you talked about, but I do think the trauma burden from sexual abuse, but just from all kinds of from violence and death of parents and other negative life events is huge. I really think so. And so I'm intrigued by thinking about trauma-informed interventions for populations where you don't have highly skilled mental health professionals. What does that look like in these types of settings? I also am sort of intrigued by, and this for less, I don't know what the right word, less severe maybe forms, just like, I think low grade, I've talked to a colleague there and we've been thinking about, I think just like, not that anxiety isn't like, and chronic stress an issue like everywhere, but I think that chronic stress and anxiety is also like a really huge issue in this population. And so we've been talking about, things like the friendship bench, which are pretty low skill, but thinking about that for adolescents and what would that look like? What does that need to look like? A colleague, Brian Pence, who's at UNC, has been doing, so the government of Malawi is actually trying to scale up the friendship bench and refer people for depression treatment in the government clinics. They just did an evaluation that is coming out that did not look very good. So, in terms of just how it was implemented on the ground, they didn't see I don't think that they saw great effects, but they just also saw that it wasn't well implemented at all. So I think there's challenges of trying to scale up mental health treatment in a lot of these resource-constrained environments. But this seems like a perfect place for people to be thinking about that. I think there's like a huge need, and like how to implement that, I think, is really important. Yeah.
This is a great crash course in this area. Thank you for that. Mine's related to this depression question also, and I was wondering if with G formula, I know you said you're not an expert in that, but is it possible to tease apart the 25% reduction in like reducing symptoms of depression in this sample versus preventing depression from occurring by 25%?
Ooh, maybe? I don't know. I think that would just change your denominator, right? Maybe? I think
it would be incident. You're trying to change the depression as opposed to just changing prevalence, which is like the symptoms. People really
Right. So that's sort of getting to the question that Emily's asking about.
The upstream drive.
Can you prevent it from occurring in the first place?
Yeah.
And what's the effect of that on HIV versus reducing symptoms once it's already occurred?
Yeah.
It's a curious question.
Yeah. I'll talk to Marie, but I think so. I think it would just, like Nadia said, kind of depend where what you're focusing on as the exposure, maybe.
And then that might lead to where you try to intervene and determining what are the cause in this group. What's the cause of depression for them in that context?
I had a question about there's all this interest in biomedical interventions, and I'm wondering, given what you've presented and thinking about the life course, how a life course perspective and how kind of some of these structural and contextual factors, what we need to be thinking about when we're thinking about rolling out these different types of biomedical interventions, like PrEP or long-acting strategies.
So HB 10082, which just wrapped up, which was in Johannesburg, Cape Town, and Zimbabwe, and Harare, was sort of PrEP demonstration study for young women that originally, so I was on the protocol. I am on the protocol committee, but I was on the protocol committee because when we started, we were brainstorming about doing some more like mental health violence type of interventions because there had been work showing that adherence was impacted by violence and partner dynamics. Unfortunately, NIH at that point felt that was too much, too complicated. They were like, well, young women aren't taking it, and you just have to show that they're willing to take it first before we add anything on. And we were kind of like, but that's the whole point. So that didn't happen. They dropped that part of the protocol. And went with drug adherence level feedback as their adherence intervention, moved away from the structural social stuff. So I think a daily pill is going to still be really hard. I think everyone's holding out for cabotegravir or one of these long-acting methods. That said, we haven't seen great adherence to depot. The family planning literature on depot adherence is not great either. So, I don't think that's going to be the panacea. But I do think, and I think people talk about this, but we know sex is sporadic and for all young people, MSM and young women. And so planning is not great. And predicting what your sexual life is going to be like for the next 6 months is not great. Some of the things from the qualitative work with PrEP, it's just been about chaotic life environments. I'm here, I'm living here, and then I'm with a friend, and then I'm with my aunt, and I don't know what's going to happen, and I don't know where I'm going. And so, how do we just make these things easier for young people? I feel like there's been a lot of focus on risk perception, and I'm just not a huge fan of it. I don't think human beings are good at perceiving the risk. And so, I think maybe there's ways to say, maybe you should think about this because you've reported X, Y, and Z behavior that seem like you would be a good candidate for thinking about PrEP or whatever. But I think how do we deal with daily pill taking, is a huge challenge for young people. I think you see that with other chronic diseases with young people too. So I think it's going to be hard. I don't know exactly what.
I just wonder because something they say a lot with the perinatal HIV infected is that you just need to get them, if you could just get them to 24, then things kind of ease up, right? And so what I'm wondering, is there a parallel for the negative people who are vulnerable? Do you just put them all on some sort of long-acting thing until they get to that stage at which, I'm wondering, she can be there. And also sort of like, okay, it's really chaotic. It's just kind of like handing her more injection somehow.
Yeah. I don't know, like if it's, yeah, I mean, I've heard that too, right? And I think, and people talk about seasons of risk or whatever, and, you know, I think that was the whole point, like that this doesn't have to be someone's whole life that they're on this, that like if you can get people through a vulnerable period on PrEP, that they'll come out on the other side and, you know, be okay. But I still think like how to deal with adherence is, you know, for a young, well person who doesn't perceive like risk, it's a challenge. Yeah. So lots of room for innovation. I don't have the answer for sure. Yeah.
Just curious about the transactional sex piece. Were you guys able to break that down a little bit more in terms of, did that mean different types of sex, like anal sex versus vaginal sex? Was that the number of partners? Like what kind of aspects of that to?
Yeah. Nadia's work has some interesting findings, at least on like partnership types where transactional sex is happening, which she can talk about. But we asked about it. So we had a partner grid that at each visit asked about the last 3. I think we had 5 and we reduced it to 3 because people quickly learned how many partners and stopped reporting because they didn't want to have to fill out the whole grid. So within the context of a partnership, which asked about all kinds of like frequency, then we asked about transactional sex, which was like a 6-part question, which was, does your partner provide cash or money? And if yes, the question we asked, which is probably a too severe definition, but at the time, right, this was like 2011, it was, do you feel like you have to have sex with this person because of the transaction that's happening? And if they said yes to that, we consider that transactional sex because like 80% said that their partner was providing material support. And then we asked about frequency of it happening. We also then had a separate question about, do they provide something other than cash? And like, it was a whole list. They could sort of say what else the partner provided to them. It could be also like social status, emotional support. Like it didn't have to just be material things. So that's how we measured it quantitatively. We've added more questions over time, which we haven't totally dug into. We've asked questions about, which are now recommended. So the London School had an initiative called Strive, which was this, I think it was DFID funded to try and better measure structural factors. So they now have a recommended way of asking about transactional sex. And I think it's sort of like, what's the primary motivator for entering the relationship? So we added that question. And we also have asked like where they met the partner. And, like we've tried to unpack, within the confines of a quantitative survey, unpack it. Megna's work, which is published, Ranganathan did a bunch of qualitative work on this. And I think, I just think it's complicated. We just are writing up some data from the Gates Foundation. So we're doing some surveys with men now in venues and in households. And we use a narrative timeline approach. So basically where we have them start with their first partner and go to their current partner. And it's been done, I'm forgetting the author here, was first done in Atlanta with Young MSM. Say that again? Yeah. It's a really nice methodology. So they're doing it at 082 and we've just done it. And you kind of talk about characteristics of the partner. You can ask about behaviors and then they assign, like you can do, it's pretty interactive. Like we had like heart stickers, like put a heart on the partnerships where there was love or put a $sign where there was transactional sex. And then like talking about as they go through this timeline, like what that means and why they said that. And then they're supposed to try and compare between partnerships over time also and kind of draw some like thoughts about like, oh, look, when like my first partner was like this, but it's been interesting to see like if they had a kid and they assigned love, but they didn't assign love to this partner, why and how. And I will say like our conclusion is basically like, it feels very gender normative or I don't know, but like, men were just much better at being very like, I didn't use condoms with this person. We both had other partners, like it was a risky relationship. They also just assign like a risk score to the like how risky they think the partner is for HIV. Whereas women, it was like, they like all these emotions came into their assessment of risk. So even if he had another partner or they didn't use condoms, it's like, but I loved him and we have a kid, so they still gave him a low score, even though there was like these like pretty solid factors for risk. So that seems to be like our biggest take home, is that, yeah. men were pretty objective about like the risk factors, and women like all of these emotions kind of, which I was like, no, that's so like, I don't know, it's too gender for me, but that seems to be what we're seeing from that. But it's an interesting method to try and transaction. You see like where there's transactional sex and not. I don't know if you want to say something quickly.
I was going to say, I did do like a little bit of work with the transactional sex, and you definitely see different types. So like by the type of partner that you have, like an older partner, all the partners have some kind of component of transactional sex, but you'll see the older partners tend to give money and they give more money, whereas other partners tend to kind of give like more romantic things, or they might give perfume. So there is a difference, and so I think like, there's all this amazing data. You could definitely explore different nuances of transactional sex, which I think would add a lot. It's not just like subsistence sex, you know, people like to demonstrate that.
Just to brainstorm, but another way to possibly frame the narrative findings could be like thinking about like obviously your work as power structures. So like men have the power, they have the money, so they're able to make a more objective call, whereas women are like, wait, like emotions could be another word for like, there's a lot of other variables here, like I need these things, so it's like less of a clear call. So I think it does break down in gender ways, but you could also like frame it differently.
Power. Yeah, that's actually an interesting thought too, because they also are like a lot more objective about past relationships and certainly like current partners. It's very rare in the interviews that they will say the current partner is a risky partner, even, you know, in the face of all kinds of risks that they talk about. So yeah, which I think that's an interesting lens. Yeah.
Lovely. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.